How to buy real estate with seller financing, aka taking over payments. Hey gang, my name is Mike with myrealestatedojo.com, and today I'm going to be talking about exactly how to buy real estate with seller financing. Now, let's dive in. Traditionally, when someone buys a home, we create what's called a triangle, okay? We have the buyer here, the seller here, and on top of that triangle, we have a traditional bank, okay? And the buyer and the seller are basically looking up to the banker, like, please give us a loan so we can do this transaction. So again, in a traditional real estate deal, you have the buyer that wants to buy the seller's home, and they both are asking or waiting for the lender to give the buyer the loan so the seller can receive the transaction. Okay. Now, in a seller financing or subject to a real estate investing transaction, we have what's called the linear. We have the buyer and the seller. There is no bank involved. So it's much more efficient transaction. Just like if you wanted to go from point A to point B, the best way to go is straight versus doing a bunch of loops and circle around because it's going to be more miles, more time. Same thing with real estate transaction. When we have a linear transaction with seller financing, when the buyer wants to buy the seller's home, they can do the deal if the buyer and the seller want to and eliminate the bank because of, two things. A, the homeowner will have their house clear and clear, or B, the homeowner will have a mortgage on their home with the term subject to the existing mortgage or subject to real estate investing comes into play. Because truth be told, seller financing is multiple types of seller financing. Today I'm going to be talking about seller financing where the seller doesn't own a loan on their home. And two, I'm going to be talking about seller financing where the seller actually has a mortgage on their property, okay? So now that we know how a traditional real estate transaction works, and now that we know how it's seller financing or subject to or taking over transaction works, because the seller will go directly with the buyer will go directly with the seller, and the seller will become the buyer's private bank. So there is not a triangle created, okay, which makes it more faster, more efficient. And there's a pros and cons with both transactions for the seller and the buyer if they go traditionally and if they go the creative real estate strategy that I'm going to share here. And I'm going to go into the pros and cons a little bit down later. So if you could hit the like button, leave me your thoughts below, and let's move forward, okay? Now, what is seller financing? What is subject to investing? What is taking over mortgage payments? Okay? Simply put, a seller financing transaction is when there is a motivated home seller that's willing to become the private bank and deed the property or the title of the ownership of the property to the new buyer without, and here's the key, without the existing loan being cashed out. So one example is I want to buy a home, I meet a motivated seller, and they have a mortgage on their property. I can buy their home by just stepping to their shoes and making their monthly payments month after month. Therefore, I don't have to come up with all the cash to buy the property, nor do I have to use my own credit because there's no bank involved. Real quick, download my free book, Real Estate Investing for Beginners, the ultimate starter guide at myrealestatedojo.com, where I teach you how to find motivated sellers, buy their homes at a deep discount, and then have the seller become your own private bank. Subject to, get it now. One more thing, if you're looking for private one-on-one help when it comes to real estate investing, then consider joining my academy where you sit down with me one-on-one. 2, you get monthly coaching. 3, you get access to my best-selling courses. 4, you get access to my video library, and then the list goes on for just $97 a month. Join me now at mrnofluff.com. Lastly, the best six-figure side hustle, bicycle flipping. Want to see how? Here's a behind-the-scene video how I did it. go to thebestsidehustle.mrnofluff.com. Now let's get back to the content. So in other words, a subject to real estate investing or taking over house payments or seller financing consists of a buyer and a seller, and where the seller becomes the bank. Now, the question is, Mike, will every seller, every real estate home seller, will they do seller financing? And the answer is no. Read my lips, like Bush said. No, not every seller is willing to do seller financing. So now that brings me down to the question so many of you may have is, well, Mike, what type of sellers are willing to do seller financing? Okay, there's two types of sellers that are willing to do seller financing. Okay, uh, seller number one, they have financial distress. What that means is that they're not able to make their house payments because maybe they lost their job, maybe they got a, pay delay, maybe whatever. Okay, there's a death in the family, something like that, and they can't pay the bills. Okay, so that is one source of sellers that are willing to do seller financing or subject to real estate investing, where they're willing to become the bank for the real estate investor or just a homeowner. Okay. The other type of seller that's willing to do seller financing or subject to investing is what I call emotional sellers. Emotional distress sellers are types of sellers that they're going to a divorce. Emotional motivated homeowners are people that, you know, maybe have inherited a home, okay, and they don't know how to deal with it because they're going to grievings because they just lost someone that they love. Okay, so simply put, there's many different types of categories of emotional sellers, and there's many different types of categories of financial motivated sellers or financially distressed sellers. All types, okay, from my paycheck got shrunk all the way to I lost my husband or my wife, and we needed both of our payments to make the monthly payments. Now, in that example, you have a seller that's financially motivated and emotionally motivated, which makes them hyper motivated. Okay, the only types of sellers that are willing to do seller financing are motivated sellers, which break down into two categories as I explained. I'll say it one more time. You have emotional motivated sellers and financially motivated sellers, and that's the only two. Let me say that again. That's the only two that are willing to do seller financing. The remaining of the sellers are not willing to allow me or you or anyone else to take over their payments. Okay, so they got to be highly motivated. And one of the mistakes that most people do is they try to do seller financing. Wow, that was a big hop. They're trying to do seller financing with every Bob and Joe seller, and they're not motivated. One way to realize if they're motivated is to have a series of questions that you can ask the seller to filter them, to probe them, to know if they're highly motivated. And you can download that at myrealestatedojo.com. It's called my Ninja Phone Script, and you can get that. Okay. So now that you know what traditional financing looks like, now that you know what seller financing looks like, now that you know how a seller financing seller looks like, so you know your target audience, because if you don't know your target audience, you're not going to be able to do takeover mortgages. You're not going to be able to do seller financing. You're not going to be able to do subject to real estate investing, because you got to know your audience. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about the two types of seller financing. Okay. There's a lot of different types, but I'm just going to talk about two types, and I've kind of already touched on it already. When I find a seller, if they're motivated, there's two ways I can structure the deal. There's two ways I can get the seller financing or subject to investing deal structured. Okay. The seller owns their house free and clear, which that means is they don't have a loan. Okay. The seller has already paid off their mortgage. Okay. But he or she's still motivated. Okay. Number two is I meet that seller, and the seller has a mortgage, let's say with a Bank of America or Wells Fargo, whatever. It doesn't matter. They have a mortgage on the property. So it doesn't matter if they have a mortgage or if they don't have a mortgage, I can still do seller financing. Now the name will differ. If they have a mortgage, right? If they have a mortgage, we call that subject to. If they don't have a mortgage, we just say seller financing. Okay. There's many different words that people use. They may use seller carry or seller carry financing or owner financing. There's so many different words you can use, okay? But in my dojo, my real estate dojo, when the seller has a mortgage, we call it subject to investing because we're buying it subject to their existing mortgage, okay? In other words, I'm stepping to their shoes and I'm making them monthly payments. If I meet a seller and they don't have a mortgage, then the same thing is happening, but instead of me making payments on their behalf to the mortgage company, I'm just making payments directly to the seller, okay? And they're getting that positive cash flow. But overall, the deal looks exactly the same. There are some differences, and let's get into that, okay? Let's talk about some of the pros and cons of seller financing for the investor or for the buyer, okay? Which there isn't that many in my book, but I try to do my very, very best to explain it to you because I love subject to investing. I love seller financing. I don't like stinky bankers. I don't like to borrow money from bankers. And I know there are a lot of sellers out there that are highly motivated and they already have a mortgage in place. So we can create a win-win situation where they win, I win, and we don't have to use the bankers. All I got to do is just take over their payments. Now, I also know there are sellers out there that own their house clear and clear, and they're also motivated, and I could just give them a source of positive income every month and create a win-win where they win and I win, and we don't have to use bankers, okay? So let's talk about some of the positives of seller financing, aka taking over payments or subject to real estate investing. The very first positive thing is that one, I don't have to use a bank. And I really love that because I don't like stinky bankers, as I expressed before. Number two, I don't have a pile of cash to buy this house in full. Okay. So I don't have to have $200,000. And if I do have $200,000, I don't have to use my $200,000. I can just keep my $200,000 in a safe place and buy the property with the seller becoming my private bank. Number three, I don't have to have credit, or I could have bad credit, or I could have no credit. It doesn't matter because I'm not using a traditional banking system, and the seller is going to be my private bank, and he's not doing a credit check, okay? Number four, one of the main reasons I love buying subject to deals is because I negotiate, and I teach you how to do that in my real estate academy, which you can get more information at the link below. Non-recourse loans. Again, non-recourse loans. Traditionally, if I buy a home, when I go buy a home, I have to sign a personally note. I got to put my signature there. And if I default, the seller, or in this case, the bank, can take over the property, but also they can come after me personally. Okay. Well, check this out, when I do a seller financing, I negotiate with the homeowner that, look, I'm willing to buy your property by taking over your payments or doing, a seller financing because you don't have a mortgage. But if I default, all you can do is come and get the collateral, which is the house. You can't come after me personally. And if they want to do it, great. If they don't want to do it, I just go to the next seller. It's no big deal. I don't try to twist their arm and persuade them. I don't do none of that stuff. This is just the way I do business. If you want my cash, this is the terms. If you don't want it, then no problem. There are other sellers out there. Okay. So when I negotiate a seller financing, I tell the seller, look, dude, if I default, just like the bank, you could take over the property. But you're not going to be able to come after me personally. If I was going to do that, then I would just go to a bank. And that's why I don't like banks, because I think that getting the collateral is fair, but getting the collateral and coming after me and hurting my credit and all that stuff, they're getting to the double, triple dip. And I don't think that's fair. And so if the seller's okay with it, then we'll move forward. Okay. So one of the main reasons I love seller financing is that the non-recourse loan. Okay. Another reason I love seller financing is because it's very, very fast. Okay. There's a linear relationship. Here's the seller, here's me. We make the decision. We're not creating a triangle. We're not asking some overseer if we can do this transaction. Okay. Now, Another reason I love seller financing is very flexible. Like, for example, I can buy the house and, and just take over the payments. I can buy the house and have the seller give me some money. For example, I did a deal a while back where the mortgage payments on the seller's existing loan was $1,500. I negotiated a deal where I only pay to the seller or to the bank $1,000, and the seller has to pay $500 to the bank. So to clear their seller's mortgage to the bank, they got to pay 500. I got to pay 1,000, but I own the property and they have the debt. Okay, so this is what I mean by flexibility in seller financing, because you can do all kinds of stuff. Depends on the motivation of the seller, depends on the property, the condition, and where it's at, and so on. Okay, days on the market and so on. I could have where I can negotiate with the seller and say, look, I'll buy your house. I won't make any payments for 3 months. And after that, I'll make payments. So I'm just giving you examples of what you can do, okay, with seller financing. I can't do that with the bank. I can't tell the bank, look, I'm going to buy this. I'm not going to make payments for 3 months. Or I'm going to buy this and the payments are $1,500. Mr. Bank, you pay 500. I'm going to pay 1,000. I'm not going to be able to do that, okay? This is some of the powerful reasons why I like seller financing, okay? Now, let's talk about some of the cons of seller financing. Now, the very first thing is that there is a risk with seller financing for that investor or for that buyer, because the bank can call the note. Because in the deed of trust, there's a clause there which is called the due on sale. Basically, what it says that if the seller transfers the deed to someone else, like in this case of me buying their home, seller financing, the seller is going to transfer the deed to me. The bank has a right and an option, maybe, to call the note. It doesn't mean that they will, but they have the option to. So the bank has the right to call the note, but it doesn't mean that they will. But the risk is there for the seller and for the buyer, the new buyer, which is me. Now, at all the times that I own real estate property, the bank has never called the loan on me, okay? And, I'm the one that is making the payments on behalf of the seller. And, it's coming from my company name and stuff like that with a different check and stuff. And they never called the loan on me. But can they call the loan? Absolutely. So there is that risk in there. For me personally, the risk is very, very small. I'm not telling you you should do this. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not a CPA. I'm not an attorney. So disclaimer is, do your own due diligence. I'm just talking about what I do, okay? For me, buying houses subject to is not a big risk compared to getting a loan and signing my personal name on there. That's a more risk for me, but I'm not telling you what you should do, okay? But that's one of the risks that I want to show you, that the bank can call the note and foreclose on the property on the seller and me. So that's not a good thing. But all the times I ever done it, it's never happened. But I can tell you one thing that has happened, which is point number two. Another con of buying houses subject to or with seller financing, if the seller has a mortgage, that maybe I buy the house, not maybe, this actually has happened to me. I bought a house from a seller. He was highly motivated. 7 years, 8 years later, the house now has a lot of equity, like over $100,000. And the seller now is coming back to me saying they want their house back. Okay. Now, in a court of law, that's not going to work because they signed an affidavit. They went to the title company. They conveyed the deed, and all this stuff. So we have all the stuff, proof that they don't own the home anymore. Even on the county clerk's office with the filing, the world can see that the deed is under my name or my company name versus the seller. But they were calling us and saying, look, hey, I want my house back and stuff like that. And even though they don't have a case, it is a pain in the butt to deal with that. Out of all the houses that I've done, I only had one seller that did that because they for some reason wanted their home back. They saw that, they could get onto their mortgage bank and see that there's $100,000 plus in equity. And they're like, hey, man, I want the house back. Okay. So that is another risk. I think that risk is more probable than the due on sell from the bank, because the bank, all they care about is, in my opinion, that they just want to receive their passive income. They don't want to hire an attorney and pay a lot of money for the trustee to do a foreclosure. They don't want to pay the realtor all these fees to relist it. They don't want to pay the taxes, the insurance, the probability of vandalization when the house is empty. And again, most of these loans that are out there, the interest rate today is lower, right, than before. So they want that higher interest rate be performing versus a lower one. So I don't, the probability of a bank foreclosing on me is so small but I think there's a higher probability that an existing seller will try to cause havoc. And they may not have a case. They probably don't have a case. 100% they don't have a case. They went to the title company. They signed over the deed. All that good stuff. Okay, but that's a possibility out there. Okay. Other cons of it is that with any kind of real estate, the market can change, but that doesn't have to do with seller financing. If I buy a traditional home, the house can go underwater because the market can change. And we saw that in 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, when a lot of people got into debt and bought a house traditionally, and now their houses are underwater. So the point number three is irrelevant or a constant. Doesn't matter if you get a traditional loan, if you get a seller financing. Okay. So again, we talked about seller financing pros. We talked about seller financing cons. And in my book, in my opinion, the way I do things, I love seller financing. Now, let's talk about some of the cons and pros for the seller, because when the seller sells their home with seller financing or subject to real estate investing, it is a con for them. Okay, it is a risk for them and pros to it. So let's talk about that, okay? So let's talk about the cons. Why is it a con for a seller to sell their home? What is some of the risks associated with it? Is that one, that they convey the deed to me, but the debt is under their name. So again, the debt is in their name. So like, imagine a noose, the debt is in their name, but I have the property, okay? So that is a risk for the seller because I cannot make the payments. And if I don't make the payments, and now the seller has to foreclose on my property to get back the property, okay? But the way I structure deals, I allow the seller in a way for them to foreclose on it because we create new trust, a deed of trust, etc. If you want more information, get into my academy. I don't have time to get into it. Video's going kind of long already. Another con for the seller is that when they go and type in their social security, people are able to see that they owe that debt still because I never paid out that loan. That's why I bought their house or I bought their house seller financing. If I did seller financing and the seller doesn't have a mortgage, then that doesn't relate to them. But if they had a mortgage, then that liability is still on their neck. Not only the property liability, but also the credit is going to show up that they have that debt. Okay. Now let's talk about some of the pros for the seller. Okay, if the seller has a mortgage, and they're in a financial hardship, well, they're not paying the mortgage anyways, so it's hurting their credit month after month. So one of the positive things is when I buy their home and I make their back payments, then it's going to boost their credit every month forward. When I make their monthly payments, it's going to help their credit that they borrow money and they're making payments on time. So it helps a lot of sellers. For example, back in 2007, 2008, I bought a property from a firefighter, and they were able to go and rebuy a new home because before I bought the house, they were 2 months behind and the house was going to go foreclosure. So by me stopping the foreclosure, making the monthly payments 5, 6 years later, it had boosted their credit and they were able to go buy a new home, even though that debt was attached to them. Okay. They just messaged me and said, hey, can you show the new lender that you're making the payments on this? Can you show us some check stubs? And I did. They were able to qualify for a new loan. So again, but not all sellers are going to be able to qualify for a new loan if they do seller financing and they have a mortgage on the property. If they're deadbeats, absolutely not. But if they're taking care of their business, they have a good debt to income ratio, they have a down payment, they can show paper trail that they don't own that property anymore, even though it's associated to their debt. Some other companies making payments on it or some other investor, then there's a high probability that the lender will lend them a loan. And that's what happened to one of my clients or sellers that I bought their homes from. Okay, so it does help out the seller. The other thing is it helps their credit if the house doesn't go to foreclosure, because if the seller's behind in their payments, the house goes to foreclosure, well, boom, they just have a black eye for the next 6, 7 years. Okay, so not only by making the payments helps their credit, but also stopping the foreclosure will help them. Now imagine a seller that doesn't have a loan, because the first one, they had a loan. Another seller may not have a loan. Well, what is the pros for him to do seller financing? Okay, well, simple. Let's say they have a house, they haven't been able to sell it. Maybe it's a vacation home. The market has shifted. They don't want to keep paying the taxes, keep paying the insurance. Their situation has changed. They can't keep taking those vacation trips anymore. Okay, now they've tried to sell this property, but the market has changed. Well, this is what's called a win-win for the seller because I can buy their home, start giving them monthly positive cash flow. They can sell their house, they can have an income-producing asset, and not pay all that real estate commission. So now I just talked about 5, 6 different pros for the seller on one transaction. Okay, there are many different situations where sellers will own their homes free and clear. Okay, and they're willing to do seller financing. Another example is, I meet a seller. They already have a home. They're making payments on it, but their parents are in a different state. They just passed away, and these people inherited the property, and they don't want to pay for the insurance. They don't want to pay for the taxes. They don't want to rent it out and be a landlord. And I could create a win-win situation where I could buy their home, save them the commissions, create them instant cash flow to the sellers, that inherit the property, while I create a win-win for both of us, where I win and they win, because I win because I don't have to get all the loans, I don't have to get into debt, I can sign a non-recourse loan. The seller wins because they can do a fast transaction. They don't have to pay realtor commissions. They're able to get what they want. For example, what I mean by to get what they want is with seller financing, I'm willing to pay a higher price. So, for example, if this is just a simple example, if a house is worth $100,000, if I'm going to buy it cash, I'm not paying 100 for it. I'm paying 60,000 minus repairs. However, I'm willing to pay 100K for it if I could do seller financing. For example, if the seller is willing to do seller financing, I'll give them the 100K, but I'm not paying nothing down payment. They're becoming my private bank. I'm having ultra low interest rate, if not 0% interest rate. And see how I can structure it. Remember what we talked about earlier, flexibility. So it's a flexibility for me because I don't have to use my cash. And it's a great win for the seller because they can now sell their home for 100 versus the 60. So this is one of the cool things about seller financing because it allows a lot of flexibility. I call it the teeter and totter effect. Well, what my job in the seller is to balance it out so we're like this, but if they're wanting to be like this, we can still make it work. If, for example, what is this? The seller wants their full asking price. Great. I'll give you your full price, but the terms are you got to carry the note. You got to be my private bank. Or we could do something like this where, I give them cash, but I'm only giving them 60K minus repairs, but they're getting the terms they want. Or we could do something like this, something in the middle, right? Where I don't give them the full asking price, and we do a hybrid where I give them a little bit more cash, but the asking price comes down, or anything we want, anything we can imagine, okay? And this is some of the reasons why I love seller financing, not only for the buyer, but also for the seller. Okay. So now we talked about some of the pros of seller financing for the seller. We talked about some of the cons of seller financing for the seller. We talked about some of the pros of seller financing for the investor or the buyer. And we also talked about some of the pros of seller financing for the investor, real estate investor, and buyer. Okay. Now, guys, we talked about a lot about seller financing. We know what seller financing is. We know what type of sellers are willing to do seller financing, what I call your audience. Now, let's talk about the 3 propellers for seller financing. This is very, very important because there are 3 steps of getting seller financing. Number 1, and please listen to this because if you're a pro real estate investor, you're a new real estate investor, or you're just a homeowner, you got to understand this. The propeller number 1 is leads, leads, leads. 99% of people, if 90% of the investors, pro or new, or homeowners, never are able to do seller financing because they don't generate enough leads. Remember what I talked about earlier? Not every seller is willing to do seller financing. Only highly motivated sellers are willing to do seller financing. So if you don't generate enough leads, you're not going to refine that gold nugget. So propeller number 1 is leads. Propeller number 2 is conversion. Now, remember earlier we talked about how do you know if a seller is motivated? Well, you have to have a series of questions you ask them, what I call filtering them to know if the seller is motivated. You can get my ninja phone script at myrealestatedojo.com, or you can join my academy, or you can get any of my courses that talks about seller financing at My Real Estate Dojo. So propeller number 2 is conversion. You have to identify and filter out the ones that are non-motivated from motivated, and then you have to convert them by giving them offers. You can download my offer letter at myrealestatedojo.com as well. Just join my academy, which is the best. Okay. The last step is exit strategy. Now, if I'm going to be an end buyer, my end strategy is pretty simple. I'm just going to move into it. If I'm going to be a real estate investor and I'm going to turn this into a rental property, then my end exit strategy is finding a renter. If I'm going to be a real estate investor that's going to buy this house with seller financing and turn around and sell it with owner financing to a retail buyer, then my end exit strategy is going to be finding a retail buyer that has 10, 20, 30, 40, $50,000 to put down, that can afford the monthly payments, and so on. Okay. So your exit strategy or the investor's exit strategy will be totally different depending on their personal goals. But the three propellers for seller financing or subject to real estate investing, or AKA taking over payments, is lead generation, conversion, and exit strategy. Okay. Now, real estate investing is miles and miles deep, but if you understand the three stepping stones, or what I call the propellers, you're going to have a lot of success because there's no reason to learn about, for example, strategies on how to structure the deal when you haven't even started and you don't have any leads. So the very first step to do, my opinion, is to generate leads, because once the leads come, then you figure out, okay, what should I ask them? What should I do next? Once you have people on the phone that you found that's motivated, then you can say, well, how can I structure this deal? But a lot of real estate clubs and a lot of coaches, they don't talk about the three stepping stones. Okay, they focus on strategies and filling out the contracts, and those are like not even stepping stones number one. You don't even have a lead. So if you don't have a lead, you don't need to, in my opinion, know about how to structure a deal, because you're not even there yet. If you can't generate a lead, you'll never get to that point, right? So the very first step, if you want to get a seller financing, is to generate leads. I have tons of seller financing marketing materials at My Real Estate Dojo. Join my academy, or just check out my free blogs at My Real Estate Dojo, guys. Thanks for watching. If you could click the like button, I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions below. Don't forget to check me out at my website at myrealestatedojo.com. And always remember, you're braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, smarter than you think, and twice as beautiful as you ever imagined. My favorite poet, Rumi. See ya.